Hello and welcome back to the channel. So today I've got some miniatures from the Lost Distillery company. So these guys, they produce blended malts that attempt to replicate the style and the character and the flavour of whiskies from distilleries that closed down decades ago. So my plan is to take you through the drams. I'll tell you a wee bit about what I think of the whisky, and then I'll give you a wee bit of information about each of the distilleries that the Lost Distilling Company is trying to replicate. So we'll start off with Ogenagi, and as it says on these wonderfully presented little bottles, the distillery opened in 1812 and it closed in 1911. Now the early 20th century, it was a rough time for the whisky industry. They were still recovering from the Patterson's crash, and shameless plug, I made a wee video about that, you should check it out. So Ogenagi, it means wind of the fields in Scots Gaelic, and it was founded in Pitlochry, or near Pitlochry in Perthshire. And back in the day, back in the late 1800s, it was one of the core malts of Dewar's blended whisky, which led to Dewar's taking over the distillery in 1890. However, Ogenagi's remoteness, it led to its downfall. So back in the late 1890s, Dewar's built Aberfeldy Distillery to produce a core malt for their blended whisky. In Aberfeldy, it just had much better transport links, it had much greater room for expansion. So Dewar's, they closed down Ogenagi in 1912 to focus on what they correctly predicted to be a far more profitable venture. Now the Lost Distillery Company, they put some tasting notes on their bottle. So they say that the Ogenagi, it's floral, it's honeyed, it's got some dried fruit, and it's got a little bit of peppery spice. And on the nose, that floral aroma, it is immediately present. If you go in for a wee bit of closer inspection, the honeyed note, it certainly is coming through. But to me, I'd say it's more a wee bit kind of juicy orchard fruit over the kind of spicy dried fruit flavours. Honestly, I'm picking up a wee bit of Vimto. It smells a little bit like Vimto in my opinion. But going in for a taste, Slanjava. Again, immediately that honey note is present. It's almost got a perfumed sweetness to it. And then that kind of moulds its way into maybe some vanillas, maybe some sort of fruits, peachy notes coming through. If I had to hazard a guess, I'd probably say there's some Auchentoshan floating about in this dram. It's super light and easy. It's a very good dram to kick off a tasting set like this, I would say. So we'll move on to dram number 2. And that's Strathaven. However, when the distillery was founded in 1829, it was actually named after the nearby town of Auchtermuchty in Fife, which might just be my favourite place name in Scotland. The distillery was opened by Alexander Bonthrone, who worked at Strathaven until he was 92 years old, making him Scotland's oldest distiller. His children, his grandchildren, they also worked at the distillery, and they were clearly competent in what they did. They successfully navigated the downturn in the whisky market in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They got through the First World War, but American Prohibition, that proved a step too far, and the distillery sadly closed in 1926. So the Lost Distilling Company says Strathaven was malty, orange peel, chocolate with a nice peaty note. And on the nose, it really does describe it perfectly. Honestly, it's like smelling a smoky chocolate orange. The initial kind of peat tang, that hits you first. And then you get like a really creamy milk chocolate aroma. Maybe more like a wee bit more like a Hershey's bar than a kind of chocolate orange. But you definitely get a very delicate, but definitely noticeable kind of zesty zing in the whisky as well. But going in for the palate. Certainly it gives you that big dose of milk chocolate, but then the smoke, that kind of starts to come in, kind of blends its way into a more kind of bitter chocolate note. It's followed by really quite an intense orangey kind of note. We've got a wee bit of smoke coming in there. It doesn't linger, but as I'm speaking, it's almost disappeared from my mouth now already. It's quite incredible. So maybe if you're looking for something with a wee bit of smoke that's not going to slap you around the face, this could potentially be a good recommendation. Tolmore is whiskey number 3, or maybe Tolmore, I'm not really sure how it's said. And it had the shortest lifespan out of all the distilleries featured here, only operating between 1898 and 1931. But when the distillery was being built in 1896, those involved, they must have thought they were on to a winner. The distillery was built near Dufton, which is widely regarded as the whiskey capital of the world, and it's slap bang in the middle of Speyside, which is my neck of the woods. It had excellent transport links, and the water was supplied by the Towie Burn, which is where the distillery got its name. However, as I have alluded to before, you didn't really want to be opening a distillery at the end of the 1890s, not with the massive crash in the market that occurred in 1898. Things they then got even worse for Tolmore. So there was a fire at the distillery in 1904 that obviously affected production. Then of course there was World War I. And then just when they thought they might be getting a wee bit of respite, a limeworks that opened up near the distillery, and that polluted the Towie Burn. And all the whiskey they produced, it came out cloudy, and blenders, they just straight up rejected it. So with no real market for their whiskey, Tolmore was forced to close in 1931. So the tasting notes of this Tolmore, they state peaches, vanilla, almonds, cream. To me, I'm going to immediately assume a wee bit of Ogenagi has gone into this whiskey as well. Those are the kind of notes that I pick up from their American oak. And on the nose, honestly, for me, I could just be smelling Ogenagi American oak. There's maybe a wee bit more of a tang to this whiskey, maybe a wee bit kind of like an orange Fanta. Maybe like if there was a kind of like a peaches and cream sweet that was in a packet of Tang Fastics, it would maybe taste how this whiskey smells. But we'll go in for a wee taste. On the palate, bizarrely, it's actually got a very similar kind of perfumed floral note, similar to what I got in the Ogenagi. Perhaps a wee bit more delicate in this dram. Definitely getting a good bit of that vanilla coming through. But again, I'm going to throw my hat out in the ring. I'm going to say that there's probably some Ogenagi in this whiskey. And for me, Ogenagi, it's got a very distinct characteristic, and I feel it does tend to overpower a wee bit. So I'm going to be completely honest, it's a nice whiskey, it's perfectly drinkable, it's light, it's easy, it's not really for my palate. So our fourth dram of the day is Gersten, which was up near Thurso, kind of John O'Groats way up at the top of Scotland. The distillery was opened by Francis Swanson in 1796, but it was only when his sons took over that things they really went into top gear. So brand awareness, it improved massively. Gersten, it was actually a favourite of former Prime Minister and founder of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Robert Peel. And the whiskey, it was exported to far-flung places like Calcutta and Buenos Aires. However, as time went on, the distillery started having problems with its water supply. And since in failure, Gersten was sold to an English company in 1872, who then closed the distillery 3 years later before demolishing it in 1882. Bizarrely though, despite closing Gersten, the English company, they thought they'd try their hand at building another distillery on the exact same site, and they called it Ben Morven after the tallest mountain in the area. Unsurprisingly, this didn't really work out too well, and Ben Morven closed in 1911, only 25 years after it had been opened. So the taste and notes, they indicate ripe fruit, toffee, smoke, spice, and on the nose, I'm kind of having to search for those aromas a wee bit more than I expected to. It sounded like it'd be quite rich, quite intense. I'm definitely getting a wee bit of noticeable smoke. Maybe a wee bit of toffee. There's not a whole lot of sweetness. But yeah, it's not giving off a lot in the nose, but we'll have a wee taste. It was giving a lot more on the palate than it gave on the nose. It's nice, I'm definitely getting that toffee on the palate. It's a slightly sweet kind of sherried smoke. And I'm just going to start to get the finish now. It's a this kind of medicinal, salty characteristic to it. I think this is probably my favourite out of the whiskies I've tried thus far. So our penultimate whisky is Dalarna, which began operating in 1825 in Campbelltown on the Mull of Kintyre. The distillery, it was founded by Charles Colville, and he had the idea to open Dalarna after hearing an excise man talk of the riches to be had in producing whisky. But Colville, he wasn't the only person to have this idea. Around that time, there was a flurry of activity in Campbelltown. So the passing of the Excise Act in 1823, that suddenly made it far easier and far cheaper to legally produce whisky. And loads of people jumped at this opportunity. So between 1823 and 1825, 8 other distilleries also opened in Campbelltown. Sadly, like a lot of the distilleries we've spoken about already, the Paterson's crash, World War I, they really crippled Dalarna. But the distillery also suffered problems more specific to Campbelltown. So being situated on the west coast, Dalarna, it was in a prime location to sell to the United States. However, when Prohibition hit, that trade obviously dried up. And just the sheer number of distilleries operating in such a small area, it led to the depletion of natural resources like coal, which was used at the time to fire the stills. Like many other distilleries in Campbelltown, Dalarna, it closed its doors in 1925, a century after it was founded. Now, replicating a Campbelltown malt, the tasting notes here, they speak of a kind of maritime smoke with some spices, with some fruity flavours coming through. And on the nose, that brininess is definitely obvious immediately. The smoke's there, that's also noticeable. And then hiding in the background, you've definitely got some fruity notes. Nothing big, it's nothing overpowering, it's nothing like a Glenfiddich or a Glenlivet, but there's certainly something noticeable there in the background. I couldn't pinpoint it, or I can't pinpoint it exactly, but there's definitely something playing on the nose there. Going in for a wee taste. On the palate, you definitely get hit with that kind of salty smoke first, but it kind of gives way to a more sweet kind of caramel note. I think that really lifts the whiskey. There's definitely a kind of medicinal quality coming in on the finish, but the sweetness, the caramel, it lifts it from being that big kind of heavy medicinal monster. I'm just going to go in for one more. I think that's maybe like the third, fourth, fifth kind of taste I've had now. With each taste, I'm picking up more character. There's definitely a wee bit of a sherry influence in there. I was kind of expecting that based on the dark colour of the whiskey. But no, that's a nice wee dram. It's complex, it's rich, it's got quite a lot going on. I'm a big fan of this one. So our final whiskey today is Lossie, which was the highest producing distillery on Islay shortly after it opened in 1817. Now Lossie, it was your classic farm distillery. It was secluded, it was out of the way to avoid the taxman. And a lot of the distillery employees, they would have coupled as farm workers to produce the barley that the distillery needed. However, despite the high production rate, Lossie, it never really stopped operating as a farm distillery. And it was actually quickly overtaken by the more purpose-built distilleries after the passing of the Excise Act. The founder's heir, his son-in-law, he was more interested in farming than he was distilling. So Lossie, it was sold to the Stewart brothers in the mid kind of 1800s. Now the Stewart brothers, they were able to convince Bulloch Leyden Company to include Lossie in their blended whisky. But what made Lossie so good for illicit distilling? Its remoteness, it was kind of its hindrance in this modern age of legal distillation. So Lossie, it was just too far away from transport links to make it viable. And the Stewart brothers, they actually sold Lossie to Bulloch and Leyden in 1867, who used up all the stock that was available and then closed down the distillery. Ruthless business. So like a lot of your Islay whiskies, Lossie, it claims to have that big, peppery, peaty note, but it also says some pears and some almonds, so there might be some complexity going on as well. On the nose, that peaty note, it is certainly immediately obvious. Definitely got a wee bit of a medicinal quality. But certainly I would say those nutty aromas, they come through quite strong as well. I'm actually a wee bit surprised. And maybe a tad of citrus as well. There's a good zing coming through with this dram, I would say. But going for a wee taste. What really hits you first, actually, before the smoke, before the medicinal notes, it's the sweetness. The smoke, it really plays a second fiddle to that sweet flavour. It's almost icing sugar sweet. You do certainly get a wee bit of that zesty zing coming through. And as I'm talking, it's developing into a sort of more medicinal flavour as well. And the finish is basically, it's evaporating as I talk. So it's not going to leave that kind of harsh medicinal note like a Lagavulin. It's not going to leave that kind of ashy, smoky quality on the palate like an Ardbeg. It's actually incredibly easy drinking. I don't think I've ever tried a peated whiskey that's been this smoky. Overall, I would probably say I preferred the Dalarna that I tried before, just because it's got that wee bit more complexity, that wee bit more going on. But I could very easily and quite happily drink half a bottle of this and not notice. It might be the easiest drinking smoky whiskey I've ever tried. So did any of the whiskies really blow me away? Honestly, not really. Though I will say that Lossie, that was incredibly Moorish. I'm still drinking it, I'm still finishing it off right now actually. But would I recommend the Lost Distillery Company? Absolutely. For what? £35, what's that, less than $50? You get 6 miniatures, all at 43%. To me, that is excellent value. I think the idea is brilliant. I think the packaging, the presentation, I think they're top drawer. If you've got a whiskey lover in your life, you don't know what to get them as a gift, I would highly recommend picking them up these miniatures from the Lost Distillery Company. So thank you for watching the first tasting that has been on my channel. These are just my first impressions with the whiskies. Tasting, it is all subjective. So just because I'm saying this and that, it really does not mean that you have to agree with me. I might watch this back tomorrow when I'm editing it and I might not even agree with myself. But if you have enjoyed the video, do give it a like. Go off, show the Lost Distillery Company some love. I think their products are excellent. And yeah, have a good one.